So I will ask my first question from Alan and AJung and Ludovic, but of course I start with Alan because as I assume that you have to go. And okay, some of these questions actually addressed during the workshop, but we would like to have the view of other speakers. So basically, we believe that they're really important. The first one is regarding to the visions. And that is like our community often promotes the vision of a society in which robots are widespread, part of everyday lives, etc. Should we as robotics researchers say these things in our papers explicitly? Do we need more or less explicit discussion of the role we want robots to play in our society and of the vision that should guide our research? So, Alan.
It's a great question. Well, firstly, I think that we should be using responsible innovation as part of the design process. And a key aspect of responsible innovation is the kind of radical inclusion of stakeholders, in the words of users, of civil society, policymakers, legislators. So everyone whose lives are impacted essentially should be part of the design process, so that, you know, it's not us trying to decide on their behalf. That's really a very bad practice. In the UK, we have this wonderful framework called, for responsible innovation, called the AREA framework, which is anticipate, reflect, engage, and act. And the key one is engagement. So engagement is really, really super important in my view.
So this is Bill. I think Alan hit it right on the nose. I think as roboticists, I think it's less that we should talk about this vision, but engage the people who are in the vision, right? But because if we are just going to make technology and pitch it over the wall to people, it's going to go terribly. And I think, you know, everyone who's affected by this, the people on the streets who will be affected by our drone technologies, need to be aware of them, need to have a say in the design process, because I think the days where we can work in our ivory towers are gone. These technologies are becoming pervasive, whether it's robotics or other technologies like it.
AJung, are you still there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, actually. I also think, you know, adding to that, I also think that we need a little bit more of a creative juice in how we promote the kind of society we would like to see with robots. Because I think the stereotype that comes to mind for me, and the one that I'm guilty of using often, is really, you know, factory floors where you have humans and robots working together collaboratively, and it's usually, in my view, a big factory floor with lots of people and lots of robots. But at the same time, you know, with the pandemic situation, I also started thinking about how blue-collar workers don't have the benefit of remote working on their manual labor work at home, like, you know, software developers do. But if we were to envision a different kind of future where robots can come to home and you can continue with your job and benefit from the remote work as well, I think that's a different kind of future we haven't really heard. I'm sure there are other creative futures we can draw on as well. So yeah.
Ludovic, are you still there?
Yeah, I was. I think it's a very complicated question, right? Because I think that indeed we need to discuss with people, but I think we need to take a stand as well, and we cannot just say we're doing science and it's not up to us to decide how the society should look like. I think it is part of it's not only to us, but I'm a citizen, right? I'm not just a scientist, and I actually do care how robotics is going to be used, which maybe will create something that is difficult for us, is that we might have to discuss about what is it what you're doing and what's the point, right? So that's an example. How is robotics used to solve? So we never talk, for example, of the interrelation between robotics and global warming. I'm thinking about autonomous cars, right? We never talk about how robotics is used to tackle any basically major issue, right? To be honest, automatizing factory floors, I mean, come on, right? It's not going to improve humanity. it's maybe useful, right? And I do think that there's a huge importance in automation, but we're missing the mark if we think that we're going to improve humanity. How is robotics going to help people who don't have money to buy robots? How we're going to, all of these things we need to discuss about that. And I think we need to discuss internally about that and maybe rethink about the kind of research we do. We've been discussing since COVID in my lab, because we do these very fancy algorithms, we can get machines to work, it's awesome, we optimize cost function, get, whatever. How is it helpful to anyone, honestly? And I do not know how to answer that. And when one of my students say, how do we do something that actually benefits, the majority of the world will never be able to buy a robot that we're building, I do not know how to answer this question. And I do think we should maybe try to answer this question.
I think it's a wonderful time to think about exactly our role in society, but this is under assumption of everyone wants to be useful. So a lot of us doing research for the fun of it. It's nothing wrong with that, but also is that this has this assumption, for example, similar to hypothesis you had in your presentation. And I just don't want to jump in. We have still, I think, one of the outsider view, Hildegunn. So are you still there?
I'm still here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a bit, of course, out of my depth on this question, but one thing I think is quite interesting when you look at kind of the entire policy framework around artificial intelligence and the COVID crisis. You have this policy in the European Union where you have more or less an industrial policy perspective on artificial intelligence, so that the kind of data is becoming a strategic asset, and you are kind of hedging around it as such, and there are new regulations to protect data and not let any data be stored abroad and these kind of issues. And that seems to have been turned a bit on its head during the COVID crisis, because now all of a sudden you need to develop vaccines and you need to gather all the information that you can and work together on these issues. So at least from that perspective, there seems to be kind of a rethink of policies surrounding artificial intelligence and industrial policy issues.
Thank you. So my plan was to go, but we have so many questions from the particular things that each speaker says. So I don't move on to the next question. And I would like actually have the audience take participation in this discussion. So the first question is from Megan. Ludovic, do you think we should make our writing style in journal less objective and inject some opinions? That's actually a good question. I have
so
as well.
That's a good question. I really do not think that we should. So it depends what you're doing, right? So if you're writing a theorem or describing an experimental design or things like that, we need to stick to scientific standards, right? There's no place for opinion there. At least that's I think it's very important. But at the same time, right, we should maybe, when we, many papers start on introductions that, oh, it would be great when robots are everywhere, so therefore I'm going to solve this very tiny problem, right? So that's part is maybe we should rethink how we write it. I do the same, right? I write many papers this way, right? Oh, it would be great when we have humanoids everywhere, right? Actually, I don't know if it would be great, but I realize I'm just being recorded, so that's an issue what I just said. But maybe as a society, we need to think about what are directions that we should invest in, right? What are maybe problems that we think really, really are worth trying to solve? And I do not have this answer, right? And we most likely will disagree on that. I really also think that there's not going to be a consensus in our community about what actually matters. And I think it's okay, but we should talk about it. And we should talk about it as adults, right? Even if we do not agree on that. But yes, in papers, I do think it depends on what the paper is about, but I think we should stick to scientific practice, right? It's very important.
Thank you very much. So I will move on to next question, and I will start with Alan, and I think he is still with us. Are you still great? By the way, I can see your T-shirt at the right now. Not in the morning, it wasn't very clear. So the responsible robotic, that's very nice. So it's about guidelines. We actually had a talk about guidelines, but I would like to, share this with all the speakers about guidelines issues. So many experts believe that providing guidelines to researchers is not enough, as they are often vague or can be interpreted differently given the context. Do you agree with this point of view? And do you think we should go beyond the guideline? And if your answer is yes, are you able to provide a set of ethical rules for your area of expertise? So,
yeah, it's a great question, and I think Andreas, who's I don't think he's on the call right now, but he really developed the idea very well that there's a big gap between principles and practice, and I think we need not just practice but legislation. We need and one of the things I'm very involved in, and I encourage all of you to get involved in, is writing standards. So standards are a wonderful way of bridging the gap between ethical principles and real life practice. So there's an amazing initiative, for instance, by the IEEE called the Global Ethics Initiative on autonomous and intelligent systems. And that initiative has already created amazing outputs like ethically aligned design, which is a kind of manifesto for values-driven design and development of essentially intelligent systems. And it's also spun out around 14 new ethical standards. Of course, they're not published yet. Only one of those is published, but they're standards in development. They're explicitly ethical standards. So please do have a look at those if you get a chance. In fact, I have a paper on those, which I'll put the link in the chat window in a second.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So it's Bill, are you there?
I am here. Yeah, I actually don't have that much to add to that. I think I'm just gonna spend my hour saying, yeah, what Alan said. Can I respond to Ludovic from the previous question, just super briefly?
Yeah, definitely. So
yeah.
Definitely.
So the idea of changing the world and robotics. So sharing a story. So we've been working with Médecins Sans Frontières on robots for Ebola response for a couple of years now, and we came into it thinking robots can really help, because if you have infectious disease, you move people back from the infectious disease. Robots are awesome, and we want to change the world, right? So that getting to his point. And the answer after working with MSF for a few years is it's not robots. Robots are the wrong answer. And it's really made me aware, especially in this COVID-19 thing, we're moving some of our thoughts towards COVID-19. We're roboticists, we tend to see problems in terms of robots. And so I think there's a real difference between a roboticist working on infectious diseases and someone who works on infectious diseases. So, maybe the argument isn't how robots can change the world, but it's like, if you want to change the world, what tools do you use? Is it a robot or is it something else? And so I think that, we all have our own areas, and seeing it through that lens is a tricky thing, because we don't want to force robots in to change the world if robots actually aren't going to change the world. I don't know if there's a point to this, but that's sort of an epiphany that we came to here a couple of years ago.
So just to make sure, I do not intend to change the world. I just hope I don't make it worse, right? It's a very different thing. I'm not very utopist on that. I'm very biased because these days, so I live in New York City, right? And I feel that I live in the dystopia since 3 months, and it's getting worse every day. So
okay,
sorry. But yeah, I think you're right. I agree with you. There's maybe a lot of problems we think we can solve, and maybe it's not very helpful what you're trying to do. And I'm just trying to understand what these are, and to me, it's not very clear. And I guess maybe you have more experience than me on that.
Is the, well, I don't know, maybe the, you know, we try and lump up everything together. Is the answer, we do our day jobs where we make robots to build widgets, and then we're social activists after hours? Do those two things have to be together, or are they separate? I don't know. That's a really big question.
AJung, Hildegunn, if you want to add anything on the guideline or any other issues that appear in the chat that you want to address, you're welcome.
Yeah, can I jump in on the guidelines question?
Sure, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to build on what Alan said, because I do absolutely agree that, you know, principles are definitely not enough. Guidelines are not enough. Standards are definitely one step forward, and principles do actually kickstart that kind of discussion. But in order for these guidelines to be impactful, they need to be implementable. So after my PhD, having, you know, talked about and studied robot ethics related issues for a while, I kind of got fed up of just talking about it, and so I went into AI ethics consultancy for a while and did an AI ethics assessment with an actual industry and their products. And what I found from that experience was that the translation of these high-level principles isn't that simple. It's very, very context specific. So as Alan mentioned before, the engagement of the future stakeholders, and that also includes the developers of the technologies and the C-level, as well as the potential users, that's super important, because we did come across the discussions of definition of fairness, for example. And when you have these discussions explicitly about these values, then you are able to see where the tensions between this particular group of stakeholders' definition of fairness or preferred definition versus this other group, and what you're trying to design this system to be fair for. And you're actually able to resolve it for that particular context. And that doesn't have to be a standard that tells you that for all applications of AI or robotics, you need to use this particular fairness definition. Like, that's not going to fly unless that resonates by happenstance with your stakeholder group. So I think I don't necessarily have like a go-to ethics guideline for myself or rule, so to speak, but I think one thing we need to remember is that these systems are socio-technical systems. They are also systems, not just a technology. So when we talk about value alignment, we're not necessarily trying to reach value alignment just through a technological design decision, but we should be also thinking about how does that impact, or how does my effort to align the values actually impact the business decisions and communication decisions, as well as the technical decisions that should all jive together for this particular product.
Thank you.
Let's jump in also on the guidelines issue. Actually, I see it also a bit from kind of the design perspective. I worked for 15 years at the OECD developing guidelines for very different issues, and I think the precision and the operationability of a guideline really depends a lot on to what extent the problem and the issue is clearly defined, and to what extent there is a consensus on what should be the best practice. So my experience from working on guidelines in this international context is that it seems to have quite a bit of value also to agree on principles, and to have some best endeavor principles and objectives and guidelines, if you like, even if they are not that practical. So that's just, I think it's not kind of a wasted time, and it can be developed as things get developed into consensus. And sometimes, of course, guidelines are just papering over disagreement between stakeholders. So that's also an issue.
Thank you. I was just, while all of you talking about guidelines, especially when AJung is talking about this the guideline has to be implementable. I was imagining if we were actually in ICRA with 4,000, let's say, participants, and ask people how many ethical guidelines have you read. I'm quite sure that not sure, but I can imagine really not many people would raise a hand. And I think the issue probably not necessarily is regarding to ignorance, rather is the in practice. It's not really feasible to implement those guidelines. I don't know. But I would like to move on to the the third question, which is about jobs. And I would like you jump in, Hildegunn, as the first person. And the question is, apart from economic recession, unemployment is a major issue in the coming year. And robotics and AI is infamously responsible for job loss. Could robotics create more jobs than it destroys? And if so, is how? And do we actually want robotics to create jobs, or do we want to explicitly eliminate the need to work? So many questions, but yeah, feel free to address.
That's of course a very big and very important. But let me start with just looking at, will technology create mass unemployment? And the other question, will technology create massive disruptions? And the people disagree on this. And there is a huge project led by Stanford University, I think, with MIT and the University of Toronto, looking at AI and jobs. And they kind of summarized what we know so far. And there is kind of a discrepancy. So they point to three kind of lines of thoughts. And one they call the optimist, which says that technology will create more jobs than it destroys, and they have some good backup for that position. And then you have the doomsayers that says, sure, we will see mass unemployment, and then you have the agnostics that say we need to do more research and look at sectors and urban rural biases and specific sectors, specific countries before we can say anything certain about it. But I think it's fair to say that if we look at history, I think it's reason for optimism. We have always heard this, that technology will destroy jobs, and we had that from the luditists and spinning Jenny being destroyed, and we looked at mass unemployment. The most famous economist before World War II and right after, Keynes, was also pointing to this mass unemployment technology. But in spite of technology being more developed than ever and automation being more widespread than ever, we have also the highest rate of employment ever. So it seems to be, history seems to be on the optimist side. And even if we turn it around and say, yes, mass unemployment will happen, I think that would also be temporary, because in a bad way, we would, people are not cheap, so they would not put up with it. You would see riot, exactly what you see right now, and riots would eventually lead to some very serious policy changes, and in the end of the day, I guess we will get back to more employment. So that's the employment part. Whether we would like to be employed or relax on the beach and let the robots do the dirty work, that's, I don't know.
I think that's wonderful, and if I may add, and then I'll have to leave, I'm afraid. So I'm going to get political again. So in my view, the whole point of automation is that we should all work less. There can't be any other reason to automate. But the fact that that too many people are working too many hours. So, and the problem is we have this polarized society. You're either working, more hours than you can manage, or you're not working at all. And the solution to technological unemployment is not technical, it's political. And the biggest problem that we face is that the wealth that's being created, and if you talk about AI, it's a vast amount of wealth, is simply not being shared with all in society, despite the fact that we all contributed to the research that enabled companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple and so on through our taxes, yet the profits are not shared by all in society. And that point, I'll get off my soapbox and say thank you so much for a wonderful
Thank you very much, Alan. It was great to have you. And thank you.
Bye-bye.
So regarding the job, okay, Ludovic, are you,
I was wondering, so the amount of job, fine. I guess you can always find things for people to do, right? There's this magnificent book of David Graeber about bullshit jobs, right? That explains that we basically can create an enormous amount of useless jobs actually to keep people employed. It's a very interesting book to read actually if you've never read it. But one of the questions is the quality of the job. Well, what does it mean, right? If you have to spend 8-9 hours a day doing something that is meaningful, that is meaningless, right? Or that just makes you profoundly depressed. I mean, then even if we get full employment, it's really sad, right? So how do we, is automation improving job quality or not, or how do we work there?
Yeah, I think it's really complicated. I think getting back to AJung's point about it's a social technical system. Here in the US, as a Scotsman in the US, it's really weird because I don't want to work too much, but I am expected to work more than I want to. There's this sort of Calvinist work ethic. Working hard is showing love for your family or something. I don't know. And so if robots were to replace all labor and no one had anything to do, then I think many people in the US would feel really guilty about that. And maybe they would have to, manufacture useless jobs more, because there is this culture here of, everyone should be working hard. And, the idea of not working hard or taking, heaven forbid, like vacation in the summer, is weird. And that mindset gets in the way of deploying these robots to do these jobs, and it muddies the conversation. So again, I think AJung hit it right on the nail. It's not just technical stuff; it's the social thing that's wrapped around it, and that's going to be different here in France, in Spain, in Britain, in Japan. It's so very localized to that culture, those cultures.
AJung, do you want to add anything regarding to the job loss or job creation?
No, I think perhaps a minor comment is, I don't have a clear answer in terms of the actual numbers, but I think I find it really puzzling that there is this huge displacement issue. I mean, there's also the labor shortage issue, and even the software engineers of the future, we're having a hard time training students to keep up with the pace of things. And at the same time, we have these unemployment rates skyrocketing as well, apart from the pandemic-related issues. And so I find it puzzling that we as a society haven't been able to figure out how we can switch our careers from one to the next, and in ways that we find happiness and joy, rather than feeling like, oh, I'm a truck driver and I'm going to be a lifetime truck driver. Don't take away my job. I don't think we were born like that, but I think our society actually narrows us into a certain kind of career choices, and that doesn't jive well with the kind of work that is available versus being replaced. Anyways, that's yeah. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. It's great to see that actually well-known world-class roboticists have such a great and deep talk about this job loss. And this is actually, I think it's one of the rare moments I'm really proud to be in this community. And it's wonderful to hear about that. I move on to my next question, which is very personal to me and Martin. I know both of us have quite a strong feeling about this question. And Ludovic actually touched upon this question quite basically all his presentation. But I would like to know more about the dual use topic from all of our panelists. So consider this hypothetical example. I'm a researcher doing technical work on legged robot locomotion. It's actually Martin, and my actual work in robotic is multi-robot system. So I feel that military is the most interested party in reaping the benefit of this technology for war purposes specifically. Should I abandon research in this topic? Is there any good reason for me to keep going? And is this question only a matter of personal feeling? And this question is written firstly by Martin, but I totally feel this question because whenever I go to a robotic conference, I actually get a lot of context from military or even companies producing military related missile or whatever. So regardless of where I mean, sorry, where I was in Sweden or now in UK, and it's really, at least for me, is overwhelming. So who wants to go first? Bill?
All right, it's complicated. Yeah, that's it, right? I think, oh God, how many hours do we have? I think it's primarily a question of conscience, right? A personal decision. I think there's a real tension between doing science, doing engineering and publishing, and it being used for whatever purpose. We as scientists give our work away. That is what we do. That is what science is. And so to say it's misappropriated by any area that's just not true. We gave it to them. And I think we have to realize that. I think, again, it's a socio-technical system. I think, I think a lot of things, in no particular order. I think if one's really concerned about it, then you don't do the work on it. But I think that may be a conceded viewpoint. So if I don't do it, no one will come up with this. You know, there's lots of people working on this. Now, my contribution to the field is small, and I am not unique. If I don't do it, someone else will probably do something that's equivalent. So I think that's a moral stand. I don't think it's a practical stand. I think, like everything, robots are tools. So if you really don't want things, I'll pick on the military, if you really don't want things to be used for military purposes, you really can't do anything. More efficient engines, used by the military. Better food, used by the military. Great medicine, used by the military. I think everything's so tied together, you can't realistically take a stand saying, well, I'm not working on this particular technology and have it be an effective strategy. I think what is more effective, again, it's a socio-technical thing. I've done work with the military in the past, and the people I've worked with in the military, I have a great amount of respect for. The systems that we've worked on, I haven't worked on active weapon systems, but I've worked on support systems. Most of the people I've talked to in the military really don't want to use them. They don't want to fight. They want to, you know, they care about their personnel. I think the focus is not on the technology and the military. It's a socio-technical thing. It's the administration that controls the military. Because I really see robots as tools. I think, you know, the larger questions, the sort of stuff we're talking about here, you know, how do people use these? How do people, you know, if we give a robot that will allow military action with impunity, that's a different thing to think about than the specific technologies. I think the specific technologies are less important than those bigger questions. Having said that, I don't really have an answer for the bigger questions. Vote, be engaged, make sure your politicians understand the ramifications of these things. It's hard. But I'm willing to bet AJung has something more informed to say than me.
Okay, AJung.
Yeah, I would love to add to that, actually. I like to frame these kind of robot ethics questions in 3 different layers of decision making. So the first layer is really about investment in applications. So where should we deploy robots, or insert technology here? And it's often the most important question, because then you have the second layer, which is design and deployment question. So once you've decided to build a robot for a particular application, then what business communication design decisions should you make to guide it in the right direction? And then the third layer is about governance, which is once you have the robots that you're developing, or it's out the door already, then how should we govern the technology and the development process itself so that it actually betters the society? So in those 3 different layers is where we can actually interject if things go wrong and make better decisions for better design technologies, or even better design socio-technological systems. That being said, I think in military in particular applies mostly everybody's fine mostly in that first layer of application. But I think it's also a stereotyped question, which is that, at least in the Canadian Department of National Defense, majority of the efforts go into the rescue missions, or, the natural disaster related missions. And we do need technologies for that too. And just because it's military funding does not mean that it's for weapons either. So I think, we need to kind of recategorize the kind of funding decisions for your research and the application decisions, and noting the fact that because all the technologies that we develop are going to be dual use unless you're at the very end of actually applying and deploying the technology, then I think we need to really exercise, at least as academics, the academic freedom to be able to voice our opinions when our developed technologies are being used for purposes that we did not intend, and that is highly problematic.
Thank you. I will go through all of the panelists. So Hildegunn or Ludovic, do you want to add anything?
Sure.
I think this is your area.
Well, it's not my area, but I was trying to discuss today, because I work with with the different NGOs about lethal autonomous weapons, right? I don't know. Everything that we do can be used for military applications, absolutely, right? And I think, as Bill said, well, either we do nothing, right? And that's what I was trying to argue in my talks, that that's not about whether you stop doing robotics or you continue doing robotics, right? It's about what do we do, right? So I was trying to say there's 3 things we could do. You can serve as an expert to try to define meaningful policies that limit the use of robotics for certain applications, especially military applications, right? What is the right framework to actually cast automation in the military? So that we do that as scientists, right? So we don't have to have an opinion about how it's going to be used, but that we can provide technical expertise. And it's especially important for a lot of states, for example, or NGOs who do not have access to the expertise, right? France, where I was born, and the US, where I live, they have military power. So they have actually the absolute expertise in those things, right? But in many countries, they don't have expertise in robotics, in machine learning, or in the military, right? To be able to think properly about those kind of guidelines. And that's where we have a role to play, because we need to give support to countries who are not capable. We don't have this internal support for their military. And NGOs is the same. The second thing I was arguing is we need to set guidelines, and social norms in our communities are very important in deciding what is okay and not okay to work on. What kind of application it is okay to work and to not work on. And as a bigger thing on the society, right, to help set social norms in society. I took my example about chemical weapons. Before chemical weapons were formally banned, they were not used. Why? Because there was a strong social norm in the US or in France, or in countries who had the capacity of using chemical weapons, that you don't use that because the population will never accept that their military use that. And we do have then scientists played a huge role in actually tilting that and changing things. So there's precedent in history, right? The third thing is that I do think that it matters where we take our funding from. I'm sorry, but if we take money from the Department of Defense, we cannot pretend we didn't know. And even if we do basic research and prove theorems, and that's what I was trying to argue in my talks, a big part, if you look at the actual investment that is done in fundamental research by DARPA, it's pretty much the public relation part of what they're doing, right? It has nothing to do with actually public research. This is what they advertise, right? DARPA is known for inventing the internet. I'm sure very few people can give a list of the weapons they actually developed, right? Yet this is what they invest the most money in, right? So as a scientist, each time we get money, and I've actually worked on a DARPA project, so it's not that I'm not trying to pretend that I'm better than everyone. I'm just saying that we need to think about it. Because each time we work, we receive money from an organization, right? And that's why we're trying to argue in a RAM article a few months ago. You actually give your name to this organization and they're going to use that to actually make themselves look like in a very different frame than what they actually do, right? And this actually matters a lot to me. I might be wrong, but I think it's very important. And again, just to put it, in the 70s, scientists refused to work for the Department of Defense because they were opposed to the Vietnam War, right? It actually had an effect on the funding scheme that there was happening in the United States. And then he went back, right? Because then there was a whole problem, how do you get scientists back to work for the army?
I totally sympathize with you, but as Alan said, it's really political. So everything you said is a hypothesis, for example, and the hypothesis, for example, you're against Vietnam War, I mean, just as an example. But I just don't want to be despair, but something that happens during your time I was thinking, so in a lot of countries, it's actually very difficult to find a funding resource that is not related to the companies or or the military, and as AJung said, not necessarily military is not a bad label. It could be a company produces missile and everything. So it's really difficult. And as a researcher, especially early career researcher, surviving without those funding is quite impossible. So it's, I don't have any solution, but it's a problem. It's really, really difficult. So yes, Hildegunn.
So for young scientists, maybe just a side note, right? If there were people in the community who really think that this is an issue, like the funding schemes that we have, we should develop supporting tools for young scientists to ensure that they can have a career without having to do that. And that's kind of a hypocrisy, right? If you say, oh, you can do it if you want, but we're not going to help you, right? In the way we review tenure cases, in the way we support postdocs, and all these things, we should do something, right? And we should take this as a, for example, someone will say, I'm not going to work for military, but I might do less research, should be seen as something potentially positive if you agree that this is a good thing on the long run, right? Which we don't do right now.
So I wonder if this is just a function of us getting things right over the past 20 years, right? If we were working in a field where it was still very basic science and we weren't able to produce anything that was useful, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You know, abstract algebra researchers do not often talk about transition to the military. Is it inevitable, do you think, that as we make robots that are more capable and more general purpose, that we can't avoid these dual uses? You know, are we victims of our own success here?
Who are you asking this?
Oh, everyone.
Well, but can we kind of like flip it the other way to say that there's no one technology that's only meant for military, unless it's like, the weapons or whatever. Therefore, there is hopefully funding elsewhere. I mean, for legged robots, just because we're sticking with the hypothetical example, the legged robot in military, you think it would go well together because rough terrains and things like that. But the same is true for forestry industry, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, right? So yeah, I think we can use the same argument and flip it upside down.
Yeah, that's right.
Hildegunn, so I'm still interested to have your views on this.
Yes, so of course I haven't encountered the dilemma of working for the military myself, but I think as a citizen, it's everybody's responsibility to kind of have an opinion on what the ethical standards for the military forces are and what we want our military to do, and how we want the military to protect our society and what is legitimate for that purpose. And as citizens, we have that responsible, all of us. And there are many examples that citizens have kind of set such standards. And you have the example of cluster bombs, you have chemical weapons that was already mentioned, and you have landmines that usually hurt children and these kind of things. So in my view, it's everybody's responsibility to engage in this kind of discussion, and whether as scientists we have a special responsibility as experts, I think that is also true. But saying that it's unethical for a scientist to work on a robot that could be used in the military, I'm not sure if I would go that far.
I just wanted to add one minor note, just because I remembered a little bit too late, I guess. I just wanted to give a shout out to ClearPath Robotics case, which is, back in 2014 or something crazy early like that. They created this open statement saying that their robotic products will not be used for military purposes, or for the purposes of killing people. And that was in the context where they were still a very small-ish startup at Waterloo in Canada, and one of their biggest clients were the Canadian military. And they were able to push this public statement out the door, and the Canadian military had no objection to that, and they continue to be clients of the company, as far as I understand. So I think it is possible to draw a line in robotics, even if you're working on creating platforms that may sometimes be useful for military people, but may also be useful for other purposes. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm good with my question. So I will basically open the floor to everyone. But before, there are two questions in the chat I would like to ask. One from Julia, which I guess she asked from you, AJung, and how do you define quality HRI? Well, that's basically. What are the criteria?
Yeah. I think I just had a little back and forth there. I mean, I think there are many things we can talk about, of which, is it actually beneficial to the user? And how do we think about that beneficence in the sense of transparency, accountability, and so on and so forth? I think there are many different layers we can dig into, including things like human dignity. And going back to my talk, if we're thinking about the ways in which robots influence people's behaviors, emotions, and decisions in ways that we don't even register in our brains, then to what degree do we have the user's autonomy to counter that influence, or source of influence, so to speak? I think all of that comes into play. But at the same time, we need to be mindful of the fact that sometimes it'll just be very context specific in defining what that qualitative understanding of quality is.
Thank you. So there's another question which Ben Karup asked, and does anyone have any thoughts on universal basic income for if robot to take over a large portion of the job market? And I'm sure many people think about that. So I don't know. My first guess is Hildegunn, but anyone is of course open to talk.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and you see during this COVID crisis that things that have kind of been at the fringes of the debate are all of a sudden becoming mainstream. So with these huge stimulus packages, you actually have some countries that are kind of going there and thinking about, okay, since everybody is affected by getting their incomes disrupted, maybe this is the way to go. And so we will indeed see some experiments and draw some experiences from this crisis and learn from that. There is always the debate, of course, about incentives and how much should this basic income be to kind of get the incentives right and provide everybody with a decent income without kind of taking the incentives for working away. But let me also say a couple of words about the premises here that now that AI and robotics will kind of take over our jobs. I actually beg to differ on that one. I don't think that is the case, actually. And the reason I'm saying that is that we are not running out of problems to solve. And we also see that, for instance, with the aging population, on the one hand, we see the labor force has started to decline in many countries already. And on the other hand, we also see that we have a large population above 60 or 80 or even closer to 100. And we need additional resources to cope with that. And AI is wonderful to kind of help human decay to kind of strengthen human abilities to do many things. So I think that's an issue. And also we have environmental and climate issues that we need to address, which has also kind of come into the mainstream more during the COVID crisis. Now, all of a sudden, we actually fulfilled the Paris agreement on carbon emissions. So there are issues there. And also there are so many things when you open technology that you can do that you couldn't do before. So in medicine, for instance, you have all these issues in fertility that you couldn't even think about doing before. So, I mean, as you automate one task and open the possibility to do new things, you will always find new meaningful things to do. So we are working more than ever, as one of you pointed to, that we are expected to work 10 hours or 8 or, but I think that's simply the case, that we will never run out of things to do.
If anyone else wants to join in the universal basic income.
I can say something about that. So as, again, a European living in the United States, universal basic income is socialism and therefore evil. I think it's culturally dependent, right? People in the US, there's this nobility of work. So getting something for nothing is sort of looked down upon by many people. But the pandemic has been really interesting because it's broken people's assumptions. And so now we have a language to talk about things like that. So it's not universal basic income, it's there's some politically appropriate way of describing that. Or socialized medicine is Medicare for all. I think this is really interesting times because the pandemic has broken a whole bunch of assumptions about what works and what didn't. It turns out the US was only 3 weeks away from socialism all this time and no one knew. Socialism with a small s. So I wonder if there's opportunity here. And I think one of the things, just to follow on about robots taking all of our jobs, I'm gonna be unusually for a Scotsman, I'm going to be anti-dystopian here. And so I have this sort of optimistic view of the future where robots do take all of the jobs that we don't want to do and free up humans to do jobs with humans, to be teachers, to be nurses. there may be an opportunity here to revalue those occupations, to be, hairdressers and people who interact with people, and to revalue those jobs, and then not value the jobs that don't actually need people as much. Of course, that's hard to implement, but that, when I think about jobs, losing jobs and gaining jobs, I think more about as a shift. And maybe there's a chance here, maybe with these breaking changes that the pandemic is causing, to revalue that social contact piece of work and stuff like that. That's my hope. Unusually optimistic.
I would like to jump in, and with this very positive note that the people's imagination has changed, the fact that US is closer to, I don't know, socialism or more. I'm in UK, in a Tory majority government, we have so much packages and things like that, we couldn't even believe that. So, but I think this is not, I'm going to finish, but the anti-dystopian is what we should, the hope is what we should basically put our hope on, or work toward on. And I think with this, I would like to conclude the fantastic panel discussion we had, and thank you all of the panelists for really valuable contribution to the talk. I personally enjoyed it a lot. And I'm sure on behalf of Martin, I would say thank you very much for all of you to join us, and also our participant who has stayed with us. And I would remind you, everyone, that we organize a special issue. So if you want to basically continue discussion, one way is get more publication out. It allows people to read. So not for the sake of publishing, is actually basically more workshop, more event talking about this, give us possibility to exchange ideas and brainstorm how we could actually moving toward anti-dystopian, that we conclude our workshop with that. So, and Martin.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for having us. This was delightful.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
That's great.
Thanks, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And
So
I think my last things is actually not only thanks speakers, but fantastic organizer with the amazing job they've done. So it was a pleasure to have worked with them to making this event, and I think I'm a very lucky person to work with these people.
Yeah, likewise.
Have a great day or night wherever you are, and bye.
Bye bye.